Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you've joined us for our first STARS webinar of the year. Today, we'll be concentrating on building your advocacy resume, CV, and Biosketch. This is going to be presented by the STARS mentors. Sarah, can we move on? Of course, we always want to thank our partners, Longevity, GoTo Foundation, and Trinity College Dublin, and also to the financial supporters that make this possible. It's a pleasure to have these incredible and generous donors that support the STARS programs. Next. We will be recording and we'll be sharing with the attendees through the LMS, which is called Lung Cancer 360, and the ISLC STARS webinar website. Your camera and microphone are disabled as usual in a webinar. So we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll have a dedicated time to answer those questions. Next. The STARS mentors collaborated on the topic of this webinar as well as our learning objectives and felt like this was a very important webinar for advocates that hadn't been addressed before. We want to be able to understand the purpose and structure of the documents that are recording our activities, and those include an advocacy resume, a CV, an advocacy biosketch, and we're going to go with greater in depth on those. We want you to be able to learn how to identify the experiences that you've had to include on each of those documents. And we're going to want you to gain practical tips for writing clear, impactful personal statements and making your advocacy experience relevant to the research that you're wanting to impact. We want to be able to keep the documents up to date and personalized for an advocacy opportunity, the specific opportunity that you're interested in. Next. Our speakers today are our STARS mentors. Those include Anne-Marie Baird, who unfortunately, after preparation for the webinar, was called away on a family illness. We also have Upal Basuroy, Andrew Kupek, Jill Feldman, Janet Freeman Daly, and myself. We're all research advocates and STARS mentors and are delighted to be with you today. Next. Our agenda includes what you see here. We're going to go further into what is a resume and each of the documents that I mentioned. Janet Freeman Daly will be presenting that section. We're going to have the delightful experience of talking with Jill Feldman about her experience as an advocate and how important the documents that we mentioned are. And then we're going to dive into what experiences should you consider including in each of the documents, and then how do you develop and maintain a resume, CV, or biosketch, and Andrew will talk to us about that. Upal will finish us up with the examples of how we use those, and then we'll go into a Q&A time. So let's start off with what is a resume. This is just kind of a definition in our context. It's a concise summary of experience, skills, and achievements. A curriculum vitae, also called a CV, is a comprehensive academic record. So it's going to be longer and more involved than a resume. A biosketch is often in narrative form, and it's a targeted short summary of your background and expertise. These may be requested from you when you're looking at an opportunity for being on a committee or something like that. So we're going to learn as we go through the webinar how to personalize for each opportunity. So Janet, tell us more. Next slide.
Yes, and yeah, muted. Having trouble getting my video to turn on. So I'll just continue as it is. So in what situations might this be useful? As Elda mentioned, you might have different organizations asking you for this, but they also might use different terminology to refer to what your position is. Sometimes it's called public patient involvement engagement, which could be shortened to PPI or PPIE. They might call you consumer advocate, which is really common, I hear, in Australia. They might be patient advocate, a patient research advocate, or sometimes at some of the hospitals or cancer centers, they may call it patient and family engagement. The information that you generate for these documents can be used in more than one place. You might also use it as part of your LinkedIn or other professional information online, or use it in your social media as part of your handles. Next slide. So here's an example that Anne-Marie provided as a consumer advocate. Note that when you get a request to provide a document like this, they might not provide you with a specific template. So here's a general overview of the things that you would want to include. Your contact information, a summary, very concise bio of who you are and what you're interested in, a background on your education, your experience, any certificates, and your skills. And those skills are both hard and soft. So you might talk about your science background or an area that you're interested in, but it's also equally important to talk about your ability to communicate and your other skills that you would have in interacting with people. Next slide. Now here's an example of something used in Europe that Anne-Marie shared. It's a standardized framework for creating a curriculum vitae, a CV, developed in the EU. It's called Europass, and there's a link there where you can find it. These slides will be available after the webinar. The typical information is similar to that list we just had. It asks for personal information. You have a profile section, a section on work experience, both paid and voluntary, any education and training, skills, and then there's a section for additional information. And she's provided us an example. Next slide. Thank you. The one on the left with the blue side is an example that is provided on the website, and the one on the right is one of an actual advocate. And I realize the print is really small, it's hard to see, but you can see each of the sections that we mentioned. There's a professional summary that states about who you are and what your focus is, your work experience, education, your certifications, your interest and references. Now, this is just a one-page overview. This might be like a resume that's a one-page document that you would provide in industry. But in this case, it also serves as a CV. CVs can look different, however, and you will have other examples. Next slide. This is an outline of a Biosketch. It's used in the US by the FDA, NIH. It's also used by IASLC. And it's typically used to give a profile of people who are the primary investigators for a grant. But it's also used for patient advocates who are on a grant. There's a top section, and this is a standard format of names. The ERA username is not something that most advocates have. Your position title and a summary of your education and training, what institutions you might have been associated with. And then there's also a personal statement about what kind of advocacy work you do, specific things related to the type of research that this grant is focused on, and your contributions to science. And that's a lot. So we'll give you more examples of that and talk more about it later in the presentation. And now I'm going to hand off to Elda and Jill to talk about Jill's advocacy experience with these documents. Oh, one more slide. Thank you. So it's very important to think about these things a bit before you start. Check on what document is being requested. See if there's a template. There may be page limits. Usually resumes might be one, at most 2 pages. CVs can go on forever. And biosketches are often limited to 2 or 3 pages. Tailor the document to what is being asked for. Keep it in plain language, keep it relevant to the particular opportunity, and be sure and mention the impact of what you've done as well as what you did. And make it specific to your advocacy. Notice that your lived experience is your expertise. That counts. Be sure and include it. And also include skills that would be transferable to advocacy that you might have picked up elsewhere. Now I will share and give this over to Elda and Joe.
Thank you, Janet. And welcome, Jill.
Thank you.
So glad that you're here with us today. Jill and I have known each other for a long time, and it's a pleasure to highlight some of the advocate activities that she's been a part of and the importance of the documents that we've been referring to. That's our focus today, is the documents and not some of the other issues that advocates run into. So Jill, tell us a little bit about how you went from being a non-science advocate or non-research advocate to the terrific research advocate that you are today.
Yes, thank you. And thank you. I really like to talk about this because, like many people, I do not have a science background. It was not, my greatest subject. But as my advocacy evolved, I did realize the importance of research advocacy in terms of not needing to be an expert in the science, but needing to understand how that applies, how the research is going to apply to patients and families, and the importance of really making sure that it is relevant and meaningful experience for people. And so that really kind of helped me with the transition from being an advocate to a research advocate. Probably, gosh, my first experience was Research Advocacy Network in 2010.
So tell me what some of the struggles are with maintaining or
Yeah.
developing. Let's just
So
start with the resume.
yeah, yeah. So, going from a resume, a regular resume, to a research resume, a research advocate resume, I struggled to differentiate kind of what is what at first. A lot of the work that we do is volunteer, but it doesn't mean that it's not as valuable. So I had to learn that, all of the work counts. But one of the most important things I think to realize at the start is a resume, a CV, they're a tool. They aren't about bragging. They're about translating the lived experience and the impact that we've had into the value, so that the science community sees us and sees our value. So I think that is one of the most important things to remember. And, it's really about, when I was first asked to submit something, asked for help. I wasn't sure how to do it. But one of the things that I learned is that I did need a consistent way to capture the work I was doing. So at first it was informal, kind of more of a running list. And then it did become these sets of documents. And so I think depending on what you're asked to do or how, you're asked to contribute, making the list is the easy part. One of the biggest struggle is, how do you categorize it, and what should it go under, and what should be included in each document. And I think that is, it is really kind of how you need to start thinking about it. And as I think Janet mentioned before, and how do I tailor it to a individual opportunity?
Very good. One of the things that you mentioned that it's a tool, and not only can it help you expand your advocacy and be a really good communication tool, but it can also help you evaluate your advocacy and how you
Mhm.
want to direct your efforts. So, can you tell us a little bit more about how you've used it that way?
Sure. Yes. I really, I wish that, there was like a magic way to be able to do this, right? But one way that I evaluate it is, really by asking, can I clearly show what I contributed and how it improved work or how it improved, it's something within the research context? And, really looking at concrete things like the ability to identify, gaps that affect patients, or understanding, different frameworks or PROs and why they're important, and pushing beyond stuff like symptom lists to functional and social and emotional impact, and really them working with teams to design outcomes that reflect our reality. And that is how, actually Janet and I and Belinda King Calvas from Longevity ended up working on this abstract about looking at the PRO tools for TKIs and really looking at what they cover, and ultimately finding what they're missing as well, and learning that not every instrument covers every side effect, and that in fact there are no instruments that cover paronychia, which is a huge side effect, and it impacts daily life. So, that's just one example of really looking at, okay, this is an area, this is a way that we were able to really impact and start moving things forward. And so I really look at it that way. And I think it also depends when you're creating these, what do you ask? Is somebody asking you to join a committee? Committees want to know, how can you contribute? Are you a collaborator? What is your follow through? So when you're looking at that, you're going to lead with, how you work with teams and some of the leadership roles you've had and some of the outcomes. If you're invited to speak, it may be more of a speaker bio, like a clear, concise, short, like audience facing blurb, which, can talk about past talks and what you can uniquely bring, the patient centered, real world impact. And I think, one of the hardest is if you're asked to be an advocate on a research project, and that's where the Biosketch, or the research focused version comes in. And here, really, the most important thing for me was to start with that personal statement. Research teams need to understand, and they need to see that understand endpoints and feasibility and burden and ethics, and that and how you can strengthen the work.
Terrific. You mentioned the Biosketch, and some of the Biosketches that I've worked with have included a contributions to science section.
Yes.
So, how can an advocate use that, or how have you used that section to communicate your priorities?
Yeah, that the contribution to science is that is, definitely I've seen that and have used that before. And I think, in that part of it, again, going back to, I'll just go back to the example, I just gave is that how we contributed was showing the gap and capturing the impact of newer therapies on patients' daily lives and quality of life. That is kind of one example of doing that. I've also talked to some of my advocacy for patient-centered dose optimization and treatment tolerability, and those are two areas where, they're kind of, again, going back to where, when you evaluate your advocacy, and I use those two examples together because they're working towards the same, goal of improving quality of life and reducing side effects and really understanding impact on people's lives. But so it can be, you can show it in different ways, whether it's through whether it's through an abstract, whether it's through a journal article, whether it's working with researchers on a science project. They're contributing to the science is, I think, a very broad topic. But at the end of the day, it's really, that you really want to bridge, kind of between what you've done, why it matters, and how the lived experience has strengthened some of these research decisions or some of the further work being done. And really include what you notice, what questions you ask, and again, going back to that focus, what are you protecting? And then those two examples I gave, it's quality of life, it's burden, and often, obviously equity, feasibility, and some of the other stuff that is tied in. But I think I do know, and I'm not the best at always keeping up, always ask for help. But I do know that if we want patient research advocates to be taken seriously, to, our partnerships to be real, we have to make our work legible. We need to show where we provide value, and these are the documents, these are what help us do that in a clear, professional way with purpose. And so I've really learned over the years how important they have become.
Thank
And I
you.
think the only other thing I would say is you don't use one static version. You definitely personalize it to the opportunity, and always ask for help when you need a second set of eyes.
Excellent point. Thank you so much. We appreciate you sharing, and we will get into the actual logistics of development.
Thank you.
Janet?
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So you might be asking, where do I get these experiences, and at what point in my advocacy journey do I generate them? Well, there's different phases of the advocacy journey. There's some people who are just starting in advocacy. There's some people that are having been active as a patient advocate in sharing their story, fundraising, supporting other patients, might decide to move into research, and they start learning about research. That's a good time to start putting your resume together. Then there's the next phase is when you're actually engaging with researchers in various projects. That's a good time to start thinking about your CV and capturing information. And when you find your research niche, like Jill talked about, working on patient-reported outcomes, PROs, that is a time when you can start putting the Biosketch together, because you might need it for research projects. Well, this isn't a linear timeline. You go back and forth through the course of it, and you might find that something that you did way back when is applicable to what you're doing, engaging with researchers now. So one thing I want to emphasize is as you develop these various activities, whether you're learning about research or talking to researchers, you join a patient advisory board or a grant review, which is often a first step, record what you do and make sure you've got when you did it and what the name of the opportunity was and who you did it with. And we'll repeat this several times because I can tell you from personal experience, and I think Jill and I both talked about this at one point, it's really hard to do when you have to go back in the past and figure out what you did 3, 4 years ago. Next slide. So there's a variety of experiences you can include. And you will, at some point, if you create a CV, you might want to list all of these. You know, researchers have CVs that might run 5 or 6 pages because they've listed every research project and every paper and every talk and every committee they've ever been on. So here's some of the things that you want to be able to keep track of. Any education or previous employment or trainings that you've got on advocacy, anytime you've been mentioned or appear in the media, original things that you've written, either articles or videos, anytime you've been involved in grant reviews or on patient review of journal articles, whenever you've been invited to be on advisory committees, advisory boards like for pharma or various committees, maybe for ASCO or ESMO or TOGA or some other organization, any volunteer positions that are relevant to your advocacy or show your particular skills, any public speaking you've done, especially things that are invited to, say, oncology conferences or to researchers or doctors, but also patient groups. And any participation you've done, like in webinars like this or podcasts or other things. Those are the sorts of things and categories you can use when you're organizing your CV. Now, it's important to note that you won't want to include every single one of these on a resume. You won't want to include every single one of these on your Biosketch. That's part of tailoring it to an opportunity that you're talking about. So when you start thinking about a Biosketch, when you have to be more selective, what sort of things you need to think about? Next slide. It's important to periodically evaluate what you're doing in your advocacy and see if you have seen any particular themes evolving or areas that you're enjoying working in or things that you've had a lot of opportunity to work in. You also need to look at what professional experiences you've had so far in your education or training that are relevant to your research activities and how you might weave that into the narrative. Which specific skills do you have that you've used? And I'll tell you one thing that is often in short supply is being able to not just listen to what, for instance, is being presented in an advisory board, but being able to think about it critically and provide useful feedback. And that's a skill worth developing for any advocate. What motivates you to be a research advocate? It's helpful to have in your documents, in your personal statement. What activities did you intentionally pursue your research advocacy? For instance, I got very involved in trying to generate cancer models for my rare type of cancer. And I then started choosing to go that way. You'll find that the needs in advocacy are huge and there's more things to do than you can possibly do. So at some point, you may want to specialize in some aspect. It also helps with your presentations because you don't have to keep researching new stuff all the time. So that might narrow it down to 2 or 3 topics that become the primary focus of your research advocacy, which is really helpful then in your Biosketch as you're writing about your contributions to science. What have you done to move research forward in those focus areas? And note that generally fundraising is not considered a contribution to research advocacy. Too bad because we all have to do it, but there are other things to think about. So now I'm going to hand off to Andrew that's going to talk about more of the details and how you build these documents.
Thanks, Janet. So we've been hearing so far a little bit about, what the CV, resume, and Biosketch are, how you develop them, and what activities you might want to include in them. So what I wanted to do was start to get a little more practical and go through some tips and just frameworks for how you might be able to develop and keep up with each of the different elements that might go into all three of these documents. So, I'll start off with some of the kind of common things. For every CV, resume, and Biosketch, you need to talk about your education, your past employments, any trainings you may have received or honors or awards. So it's a good idea to keep track of these as you go along. And with a lot of things on the resume, you need to remember that each item needs to have the date you received it or the start end date if it was something like a position. And usually a lot of these will ask for both. Some of them only ask for the year, but a lot of them will also ask for the month and the year. So don't forget to include both of those. Now, one thing that I do want to call attention to is you don't necessarily need to list every position or honor on the final resume that you personalize for a specific opportunity or position that you're applying for. So you're going to want to focus on each document for kind of two categories. Things that show, first, your research advocacy and cancer expertise or your recognition in that area. And also, not to forget things that demonstrate competency in a relevant skill area. So things that can be relevant for all types of advocacy work, being able to work on a team, leadership management, public speaking, and your ability to communicate. If you do have some experience with data or science in another field, that can be helpful too. But these, you want to be able to pick and choose things that are relevant to the specific opportunity you're applying for. So I recommend it just can be helpful to create a master list to select from to personalize for each opportunity. A lot of times it can be really daunting if you jump right to working and writing the CV or the Biosketch. And it can be helpful just to start with some of these lists first and just try to get together all the things that might go into the section. You can go to the next slide. And then related to that is the individual activities that you've done as an advocate and the outcomes of those activities that you want to list. So this is the part that can really grow out of control as you go along and are an advocate for a longer period of time. I know as Janet and Jill and others mentioned before. So one of the biggest advices I have for this is to start tracking now. I know this will be said a lot of times throughout the presentation, but it's worth reiterating. Remembering long past details of something you did, even a year ago, 2 years, who you worked with, what exactly was your role can be difficult. So, again, I kind of, you'll have to personalize each resume, CV, or Biosketch for a specific opportunity you're applying to. So it can be helpful just to make a master list to start with activities. And this will allow you to keep up before you have to make a final document for a final position. So you're going to want to maintain some key things for each of the activities. Of course, the date, the month and the year that you did the activity. And it can be helpful to write a little blurb about what your actual role was. If you were on an advisory board, what were you asked to speak about? Or if you were on a research team, what specifically were you helping and assisting with? And then also, I think it's a good idea to compile the outcomes. So these are just, or as Janet put it earlier, I like the way she even said it, the impact you made through that activity. Things that Janet mentioned in the last section, things like medias, videos, or interviews, articles you were involved in, scientific publications you were involved in, and the citations for that. But also, you may not have something like an article or a journal article for everything that you participate in, but you can record some kind of metrics on your impact. For instance, if you were involved in advising for a project that was then deployed to certain patients in an area, how many patients were involved in the research study or the opportunity that you were talking through? Or did you help develop some kind of educational or tool that was used in a research study? How many people were, how many places was that used in? Thinking about things you can just state. So once you have that list, then you can use that list to select activities and personalize for specific opportunities you're applying to. So you don't necessarily have to take on the task of sitting down and updating the entire resume, CV, or Biosketch every time you have a new activity. Just maintain this master list, and that will allow you to keep up throughout the year. And then you can set a schedule for yourself, once or twice a year to update the final CV, resume, or biosketch. And one thing I want to call attention to is that, a lot of stuff of you'll be recording is online. Things like videos, articles, even journal articles. But it happens to all of us. Just keep in mind, especially as your advocacy career grows, um, things can be removed, and articles can also be behind paywalls. So save physical copies when you can. Next slide. So starting with the last two things, for Biosketch specific things, the personal statement can be a bit difficult for people. It's not really something we're used to writing. So I just like to remind people, it's not just about telling your story, you're making a case for yourself. It's also a short, high-level overview. You're going to go through the specifics in the rest of the Biosketch. So I find when you're getting started, to make it a little less daunting, it can be helpful to develop it as two parts. I've made a really generic example that you can look through on the slides on the right. But the yellow part is something you can draft now. This is something there's a general introduction about your focus and interest and experience as an advocate. You'll use this in every biosketch. But then second, the red part is something you'll draft later when you have a specific opportunity. This is a conclusion that you'll personalize that specific opportunity. Maybe you're getting involved in a project about lung cancer screening. So in this last bit, you can really focus in and talk a little bit more about things you may have been involved in screening or personal experiences you've had with screening. And so that can help you kind of get a start on it now and then personalize it for each thing. And that's not the only way to do it, but it's the way I do it. So you can go to the next slide. And then just to talk about the last part of the biosketch, your contributions to science section. Each part, this can be a little difficult to draft too, and especially when you're first starting. And I think just to remember, each part of this, you're wanting to show a theme or an area of expertise or impact that you've had. It's not just a list of one-offs of your positions. And you're going to back up each top bullet point, a short narrative with examples of things you did under it. So to start an outline, just how I recommend kind of starting this is that activity list you made earlier, where you're looking at all your advocacy activities. Just as an exercise, take it periodically and start to group the activities together. Look for themes or relations that you have between your activities. And this can naturally kind of help you figure out how you should structure this section. I've given an example on the right of how different activities that fell into different themes. You don't have to try to write the narrative at first, just see how things associate together. And if you do that periodically, you'll have it. But keep in mind that the groupings and examples may need to be updated over time. So it's a good idea to set a schedule for reviewing and updating once it's drafted. And you can go to my last slide. So in conclusion, just leave you with a few several tips for this. Requests can have tight timelines. It's important to work on maintaining the elements of your documents throughout the year to avoid having to scramble at the last second. I've gotten requests with only 24 hours or 48 hours to turn around something. You're also going to want to have a system for keeping track of your activities and outcomes between full updates. And that's why I talked a lot about having a sheet, something to track your activities. Like some people use a spreadsheet, other people use online resources. Just have some kind of system that works for you. Also consider long-term developing a bare bones resume or CV or biosketch with common elements. You'll start to see over time there are things that you're going to put on every document regardless. And then you can have that ready to pull out and then personalize for each opportunity. But don't forget to review and update the bare bones drafts on a schedule. And once you start seeking opportunities, you also want to think about how you're going to make this visible for people to see. A lot of advocates consider having a blog or web page where they can post living documents. And having an online version can be kind of useful because you can link to videos, papers, articles, and things, etc., that people can have a more interactive version with that. So that's just in general. What I want to do now to get a little bit more into the weeds and share specific examples is hand it off to Upal to walk us through a few specifics.
Thanks so much, Andrew. I have the privilege of using examples of what a resume, a CV, and a bio sketch can look like from three advocates that I deeply admire, and all of you know all three of them. So I'm going to get into the weeds, and one of the things that I do want to sort of do is use or I would say use language from a resume, a CV, and a Biosketch to show you how research advocates write these different documents. And the first example that I'm going to use is that of a resume. And I'm going to use language that comes from Kim Norris, who is the president and co-founder of the Lung Cancer Foundation of America. And I think most of you know her or have heard her speak at different meetings. Now, as you can see, this is a resume that Kim's written for her advocacy work. The first part of the resume very clearly discusses Kim's connection to lung cancer. It's very clear, very precise. It doesn't get into too much of details, but it clearly states what that connection is, that she's a caregiver to Roy, who was diagnosed with lung cancer. Next slide, please. Then after that, she provides a very succinct summary of the impact of her advocacy work. As you can see, she uses language such as, because of their exposure to clinical trials, Kim was motivated to make a difference through lung cancer research. So it's very clear, and then became a SPORE advocate. So it's very clear. Again, she's not using a lot of words because this is a resume. As you may remember, Janet, Andrew talking about how a resume is sort of a short version. Very clear, very succinct. Next slide, please. Then she lists her recent advocacy experiences. Again, as Andrew mentioned, you don't have to list everything in a resume, some key achievements. And that's an example of how she sort of lists what some of her recent achievements are. And finally, next slide, please. She puts in a little bit of information about how her past experience professionally is helping her in her current advocacy. And this may or may not be true for you, but we must remember that we all have a past before a lung cancer diagnosis. And if you feel that there are certain skills that are portable from your professional work into your advocacy experience, that's something you can highlight in the resume. So that, in a nutshell, is an example of how an advocacy resume can look like. And again, a huge amount of gratitude to Kim for letting me use a resume as an example. And now let's move on to the next slide, where we will do a little bit of a deep dive into what a CV can look like. Next slide, please. And Janet does not need any introduction to this group. And Janet, again, thank you very much for letting me use your advocacy CV as an example. Again, to start off, as you can see, the title of the document is crystal clear. It says CV and, of course, Janet's name. Next slide, please. Then in her CV, the first page of the CV, Janet provides a very high-level summary of who she is, and it's bulleted, so very concise, crystal clear. And in that summary, she very clearly provides information on how she's connected to lung cancer and key advocacy achievements. So this is almost like the executive summary of a CV, keeping in mind again that a CV is the longest of the three documents that we've discussed. So it's always nice to have a little bit of an executive summary to a CV. Next slide, please. Then she clearly lists her prior work experience. And as you can see, she's included both her professional work experience and her advocacy work experience, and she lists them very clearly. And again, keeping in mind that a CV is supposed to be exhaustive. It's that master document. Andrew used that word master list. I sort of see the CV as a master document. So it should include details. And last slide on CV. So moving on to the next slide. And since it's that detailed document, Janet's included additional sections highlighting specific aspects of advocacy and professional experience. For example, honors and awards, conferences and symposia, then professional memberships. All of you, or I would say a lot of you, are members of ISLC, so that should be mentioned in your CV. In fact, that's something you probably want to mention in your resume as well as your bio sketch as well. And then, of course, bibliography. And bibliography is another word for publications. So if you have co-authored a blog article, or if you've written a blog article, or if you've published an academic article with a researcher, it's always good to include the number of views if it's an online article, or the number of citations if it's an academic article, because views, downloads, citations, these are different ways to demonstrate the impact of writing. So again, hopefully using Janet's CV as an example, and again, Janet's CV is huge. So if I had to actually use the whole of Janet's CV for the presentation, I would need 25 slides. So I've just picked bits of Janet's CV to clearly demonstrate the type of detail that you should be including when you're writing your advocacy CV. And again, keeping in mind that the CV is probably the longest document and should include everything. And then finally, next slide, please, moving on to what a biosketch can look like. And here again, I get to use Jill's biosketch. And thank you, Jill, for letting me use your biosketch as an example. Keeping in mind, again, what you heard from Andrew, from Janet, a biosketch will have some of the other details that will show up in a resume and in a CV. For example, advocacy and professional experience in education, all of that will end up in a biosketch. But the key differentiating thing that separates a biosketch from a resume and a CV is the customization that you do for a research grant. And in this case, as you can see, Jill's example, she clearly connects her past and present lung cancer lived experience to the specific project at hand. And in this case, this particular project is a project focused on lung cancer screening. And she very clearly states that what that connection is as a caregiver, as a patient, and then, of course, worrying about her daughter. Very, very clear. Clear connection to the project. Next slide, please. And finally, what Jill also does in the biosketch is she connects her past advocacy experience to the specific project at hand. As you can see, she's written that they have advised and consulted on multiple clinical trials and deeply committed to ensuring research is informed by lived experience. And she's excited to be a co-investigator. So again, you can see that the biosketch has that kind of customization where you bring in your lived experience and your advocacy experience and tweak it to meet the needs of the project. And so moving on to the next slide, which is really my summary slide, I wanted to kind of sort of give you a quick snapshot of what the differences between an advocacy resume, an advocacy CV, and a biosketch are. Now, length, of course, the resume is supposed to be the shortest, the CV is supposed to be the longest, and really there's no strict limit. And then, of course, the biosketch is somewhere in between. And very often, a biosketch will use a specific template that the project or the funder will provide you with that you need to populate. The purpose, the resume is the first step. Again, if you remember Janet's slide of that journey, the advocacy CV is very comprehensive, and the biosketch is customized to that specific project. Now, how do you list publications? Again, in the advocacy resume, some key ones. Again, Andrew brought that up. The CV is extensive, and biosketch, again, customization. Professional activities, again, as you can see, the CV is again supposed to be the most comprehensive with different levels of depth in a resume and in a biosketch. Now, in terms of format, the standard format for a resume works, and Word has a standard format. So if you don't have any other format, you can use the standard Word format, and the same for CV. But biosketch, as I mentioned, very often comes from the grant from the funding agent. They might have a specific template. And finally, how often do you update them? Now, my personal sort of way of doing this is I always keep my CV updated because it's really that master list. I loved Andrew's word, master list. You keep that updated and then you pull from that for your advocacy resume, which is really going to have some key updates, as you saw in Kim's resume, and your biosketch will have those updates that are most pertinent to the project. And again, a huge amount of gratitude to Kim, Janet, and Jill for letting me use their documents to give you a snapshot of how these documents can actually look like. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Elda, who's going to moderate the Q&A part of today's discussion.
Thank you, Upal and Andrew and Janet. We are right now, the Q&A box is open and there is nothing in there. So we're going to go ahead and start off. But as you think of things, please add to it. One of the things that the mentors would like to talk about is anyone want to tell us how they maintain? Do you have a tool that you use, or and I'm with you, Upal and Andrew, that I like the term master by using your CV as a master. So, anybody want to say how they maintain their CV?
Poorly.
Yeah. Ideally, I think it would be great monthly. I definitely, I'm not great at keeping up with it, but for those of you who have been in it for a while too, my daughter conveniently told me about a year and a half ago to Google myself. So, you can do that, go through hard copies, but otherwise, really your calendar can also be kind of your best friend when it comes to looking at meetings you've had and events you've spoken at or things that you have worked on. And if you could just keep that running list updated as much as you can, I think that's the best way to do it.
Well, and another thing I did that kind of helps with that, you don't usually get emails or communications regarding to each of these opportunities.
Mm.
So I've created folders on my PC that I do it by year. And then for each of the opportunities that I get involved with, I put the date and the name of it as a folder and stick the emails in there so I can go back and review things that I've done in the past.
Yeah, that's a great point, Janet. I've done that well. Like a lot of even within some of the email programs, like I know Gmail and Outlook and others, you can create emails folders, and I do kind of a similar thing where like if I get an email that was like corresponding about a certain opportunity, a certain thing I involved in, I put it in there, and then I can go back. But I also saw someone in the chat said they maintain an Excel spreadsheet. I'm not great, but I try to put in a spreadsheet because I personally I find it hard. Sometimes when I open like my formal CV or my resume, I feel like I need to get all the formatting right and I get bogged down and actually doing it. So sometimes just having a spreadsheet and just really quickly and formally writing down, here's what I did, here's what, here was my role, did what came of it. I like to put it in that so that can be helpful too.
Okay, we have a question that came in from John, uh, and he's thanking us for the presentations. But what are your views on including a personal photo?
I think that depends on the country. And again, coming from India, when someone creates a resume or a CV in India, it is very customary to include a photo. But now living in the United States, I have not seen a resume or a CV that includes a photo. So I think it depends. I don't think there's anything. If you want to include a photo, that's fine. But in the United States, at least the norm is not to include one.
But it is very
And
helpful to have a headshot on file in case you
Yes.
get asked for one.
That's a very good point, Janet, because that very often accompanies the request of receiving a resume or a Biosketch or a CV.
when I've seen, especially if you're asked to speak at a conference or something, they'll ask you for a headshot with a narrative vibe sketch that they can include in the program. So
There's
be
another
prepared. So,
there's another comment in the chat. Should these documents be written in third person or about yourself?
I think it depends on the document and what you're doing. Like obviously, like the personal statement on a Biosketch is written in first person because you're kind of telling it's supposed to be a narrative of your what you're about and what your expertise is. But some of it naturally comes out third person. Like the resume is more like just your listing positions and things like that. So I think it depends on the type of document, and that's why I think when the NIH made the Biosketch format, they specifically use the words narrative and other things to try to get people to be like, you should be talking about yourself first person here. You should be kind of telling more of your story. But I don't know if others want to add to that.
I think that's basically it, Andrew. I think the
Hmm.
personal statement, if it's a personal statement, you always use the first person. And Andrew's example of the NIH Biosketch personal statement is a great one. My advice is always to write that in the first person, and anything else you can default to the third person.
However, if you are, when you're speaking or on a panel and they ask you for a bio, I usually write that in third person.
That's a very good distinction, Janet. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think too, sometimes you'll be asked for a short bio with, just 300 words or, something really short like that. That should be third person too. But there are also different bio lanes that they will ask for. But just to clarify, a bio is different than a bio sketch. A bio
hmm
is what if people on the panel or people at the conference are going to read about you, so it's really, partly kind of, it can be lived experience narrative. And then the rest is kind of, in the third person, what you have done and some of the work you have done and really the roles you've played and obviously also impact.
And I'll just add to what Jill said that at least from my personal experience, listing your accomplishments is easy, but writing the narrative actually is always very difficult. So I would recommend that, when you have a little bit of time, write out a bio for yourself that you can keep updating and also write out that narrative piece, the example that I shared of Jill, that if someone would ask you to participate in a grant, what would that narrative look like? I would not wait to do that till that opportunity comes because it really takes a lot of time to come up with a bio or a bio sketch narrative that you feel proud of. So I would do that now when, when you're just, when you're sort of getting ready to start your advocacy work.
Yeah, I do that too.
Terrific. And uh, our time is running out. And so I'll ask Sarah to share our concluding slides, please. Thank you, panelists. Great job.
It was such a pleasure.
Yeah.
So we've just compiled some takeaways that you can add to as you think about our webinar today. You think about the differences between a resume CV and Spile Sketch. The main thing that we want you to know is to start tracking and documenting your experiences now in whatever fashion you need to. You keep the documents current and make them publicly available. We've talked about a number of different ways to do that on blogs, or I think you can do it on a LinkedIn type situation too. So you customize the document to the opportunity, and you periodically evaluate which experiences help focus your advocacy and how do you want to make a difference. So this is not only a outward looking thing, but it's an inward looking thing too, because you can't do everything and do it well. So next slide, please. We really want to thank you for joining today. I know time is limited, but we hope that we've added value to your day and to your advocacy experience. Reminder that we will be putting the recording on the Lung Cancer 360 and the STARS, ISLCstars.org website. If you have any questions, help us just answer excuse me, the evaluation questions will be coming to you after the webinar is over. And we ask that you answer those so that you can help us prepare for future sessions. If you have any other questions, just contact us at the email address given there. That will get a message to me, Janet, or Sarah, and we will distribute the question to whoever needs to answer it. So thank you so much. I hope you have a great day and take care.